Josh, are you there?
I am here, Brink. How are you?
I'm good. So we want to start off talking about your new issue, or your current issue of the magazine you edit, Boston Review.
Right.
Which I'm holding up for the cameras here like a kidnapping victim, proving that I'm still alive on the date in question.
Yeah. Well, I'll do the same. Unpaid free advertising, and particularly free advertising from you. I'm very grateful for it. You know, Brink, I'd like to make you feel really at home here. I can't quite do it. When I look out over my shoulder, I can't point the camera this way because of the California sunlight, but when I look out over my shoulder, I see the tower of the Hoover Institution, which is
very good,
just a few hundred yards away. I'm not sure, actually, how comfortable you're feeling with the Hoover Institution.
There's some people over there that I feel very comfortable with, and some people not so much. But it's an august institution, and your publication, Boston Review, is an excellent publication that I only discovered not too long ago. But I found lots of interesting stuff in there, and in particular, the current issue is featuring some articles on international development. I figure we can launch into this with a little nod to what's going on in the news these days, in particular the agonies of Paul Wolfowitz, head of the World Bank and former Pentagon official, who is under fire and being called upon to resign for setting up a sweetheart deal for his sweetheart.
For a sweetheart, yeah.
It's, I think, just a perfect example of the genius of the Bush administration, the kind of anti-Midas touch they have. Everything they touch turns to ruin. Here's a fellow who is pulling the Bob McNamara routine and atoning for war guilt by moving over to the World Bank. By supposedly the centerpiece of his tenure was a fight against corruption. And how does he start things off? But by setting things up for his girlfriend, so it's business as usual, I'm afraid, for the Bush crew.
It's a pretty bad thing. I mean, it's bad enough to have been one of the principal architects of what I think is, by everyone's measure, a disastrous policy. I don't know where you were on the policy going in. I thought it was disastrous in conception. It's been equally disastrous in execution, but my own view is that the disasters in the execution were predictable. But having helped to make a ruin of American foreign policy, and having frankly helped to make a ruin of the lives of a lot of people in that country and region who had suffered enough already, now to have done serious damage to the World Bank, which has a very important mission. Whatever you think of the execution of that mission, it's a terrible thing. And yes, you're right. I hadn't quite seen if I can put it this way, the irony of the fight against corruption being conducted by somebody who seems to have been capable of extraordinary corruption himself. It's a very sad thing, but a sad thing because of the incredible importance of the mission of the institution. And in a world in which you've got 1 billion people living on less than $1 a day and 2 billion living on less than $2 a day, the World Bank has lots of work to do, and in my own view has done lots of good things. It's very unfortunate that.
Well, before we start talking about your issue and the particular articles and points they make and the issues they raise, I'll just make my heartfelt confession of error that I did support the war going in, and therefore my sense of betrayal is all the deeper since I at one point put my trust in those people.
Yeah. Well, there was a sort of an amusing Maureen Dowd column going into the war, and which for me kind of summarized the difficult position of people who were putting a lot of trust in the crowd that was running the show, where she compared this to the high school girl who goes to the senior prom, and her date tells her in advance that he's rented the hotel room, and then she's surprised about where they go afterwards. I think that this was just not a bunch of people to be trusted. So maybe somebody could have done this right. I doubt that. But these guys. Well, anyway,
well,
you've acknowledged your.
Move on to cheerier topics like global poverty.
Yes. Yeah.
So tell us about this issue and the pieces by Birdsall and Banerjee and what they're on about and what you think of what they're saying.
Well, I'll take them in reverse order. So Abhijit Banerjee, former colleague of mine from MIT, where I taught for a very long time. He was in economics, I was in political science, but we were both there. And he is one of the people, he's a director of MIT's Poverty Action Lab. And the Poverty Action Lab is about taking the idea that you have in kind of medical research, for example, that you don't try things, that you do randomized experiments to test drugs before you start handing them out to people, because you want to know whether they work or not. And it's pretty hard to find out whether or not things work. So the idea of the Poverty Action Lab is that economic development, addressing issues of poverty and destitution, very, very incredibly important issue in the world and in the lives of people. And their idea is we really don't know what works and what doesn't work. So they have pioneered the practice of running randomized field experiments. They've got a couple of hundred of them going in the world now to figure out what kinds of development programs work and what kinds of development programs don't work. So Abhijit has written for us before on this subject. This is a piece that really takes a larger swing and is a kind of critique of a lot of work that has been done, as he thinks of it, for the last 250 years in economics and in political economy about the roots of economic growth. And he thinks that there has been a kind of orientation to, let's figure out the one big lever that people need to put, the button they need to push, the lever they need to pull in order to get an economy growing. And his view is that this is a completely misconceived question.
Yes.
And and there are two stylized misconceived answers. One answer, an old answer, nobody really believes it quite anymore, is planned economy. That's what you need to get things growing. A different stylized answer, believed more recently and implemented, Washington consensus, deregulate, marketize, privatize, have a shock to the economy, and both of these, he thinks, depend on believing that you understand a lot of stuff that people don't understand. So he thinks we don't know how to get economic growth beyond a few rudiments. So So this is an elaboration, a development of that idea, about the lack of understanding that we have, and then a proposal that there are some things that we're starting to understand about more focused project-based development in areas of health or education, or for that matter in fighting corruption. And there are some examples of this both in the article and in sidebars by some people who are affiliated with the Poverty Action Lab. But the general message of the article, I think, is a message about an appropriate attitude of humility that we all ought to have about what we know and what we don't know.
Yes, I found that quite refreshing.
Yeah, it's very refreshing, and it's in the spirit of your sensibility about which I share, about cutting across traditional political and ideological divides. I think this is an important message for people who have traditionally been on the left and traditionally been on the right, on whether the libertarian right or any other right, to take on board that humility that, when somebody says the latest studies have shown we all ought to, I don't know, if not reach for our guns, reach for our textbooks on experimental design or something.
Well, before we move on to what Nancy Birdsall has to say, let me just jump in and give my 2 cents in reaction to your summary there. And I guess what I would say is that we do know what causes economic growth, or that is, we do know the institutional arrangements and policies that are most generally favorable for economic growth. We know that economic growth comes with stable political and market institutions that allow entrepreneurship and investment and a large-scale division of labor where millions of strangers can cooperate peacefully with one another. That requires a stable arrangement of property and contract rights, which requires political institutions that can secure and enforce the rule of law, and it requires some kind of commercial or entrepreneurial culture in the populace to take advantage of the incentives that the institutions provide. What we don't know is how to get there from here, if here is a poor, underdeveloped country. And I will confess from the free market camp that we thought we knew more 15, 20 years ago than we now think we know. That is, as you alluded to the Washington Consensus, there was an idea as communism was falling and as developing countries were moving away from the old state-dominated economic development model and the import substitution model and towards integrating into the global economy. There was an idea that if you followed a few simple steps, if you achieved macroeconomic stabilization and got budget deficits and inflation under control, if you privatized your state-owned industries, and if you opened up your economy to international trade and foreign investment, that the rest would sort of take care of itself, and you would have a pretty good shot of getting on a kind of glide path to sustainable economic development, and then after a couple of decades, a remarkable improvement in your country's standard of living, a la the experience of the East Asian countries. And as it has turned out, a lot of countries made more or less serious efforts to implement these big policy changes, and some of them have reaped great benefits from them, but a whole bunch of countries have done a lot of the right things and don't have a lot to show for it in terms of increased growth rates or big increases in well-being for large chunks of their population. And so there's a kind of a liberalization hangover right now, as it has turned out that getting on a sustainable growth path is just a lot harder and a lot more complicated than we might have thought, and in particular, figuring out how to start from bad policies and bad institutions and bad political culture, and how to somehow or another get in a virtuous circle where one set of improvements leads to another set of improvements, and on until things start working well. Anyway, it's deeply mysterious, and there seems to be more than a small element of luck involved to particular countries hopping out of the gutter and onto a better path. So I think the idea of randomized testing of aid projects is a creditable one, and clearly it's an idea that wasn't much in evidence in the past decades of foreign aid. You had foreign aid agencies cocksure about what they needed to get done, and often completely wrong about what they needed to get done in the 60s and 70s with a faith in central planning and state-led economic development. In more recent years, a faith in market-led economic development, but still kind of following the general path of giving a lot of money to governments and hoping they'll do the right thing with it. So I think this move in the direction of really a more social scientific approach is a good one as far as figuring out what kinds of policies might work and might make a difference. Still, you're faced with the, I think, fairly intractable problem of all foreign aid programs that are done on a government-to-government basis is once you figure out what works, how do you have any assurance that the government you're giving the money to is going to have the correct incentives to do what works?
Absolutely true on that last point. There are a couple of things that I wanted to comment on by way of response, and we can come to the East Asia point last because it's a segue into the Nancy Birdsall piece. But one concern that I have about well, first point is that I should say that the great aid pessimist now, Bill Easterly, who just did the White Man's Burden book, is very much in agreement with the Banerjee Poverty Action Lab approach to these things. In fact, he said in a brief conversation that we had about a year ago that if Banerjee is an aid optimist, which is how Banerjee describes himself, then Easterly didn't think that the difference between aid pessimists and aid optimists was so great, because he found a lot agreeable in the Poverty Action Lab approach, and it's something that he more or less endorses in his in the White Man's Burden book.
Let me just jump in with a quick plug. The web magazine that I edit, Cato Unbound, had an issue on what can foreign aid accomplish that featured Bill Easterly as the lead essayist, and had a very lively debate with folks from a variety of different points of view. And as I recall, he had nice things to say about this kind of approach.
I think it's a good thing. The one thing that we're at least at the kind of 30,000 feet that we're operating at now, where I feel some sense of potential disagreement, and I suspect that the disagreement might remain as we descended from 30,000 feet. You focus, Brink, on the issue of getting from here to there, and emphasize that we have a pretty good idea of where there is, what there is, and generally speaking, it's a matter of stable property, secure contracts, rule of law, markets, political stability, not much corruption. And I guess what I think is, well, yes, but I don't really think that says all that much, because there are lots of ways of running a successful market economy. The United States runs one, and we both have lots of criticisms of it, but every market economy if every economy in the world were doing as poorly as the United States, the world would be in a lot better shape.
Absolutely.
The Swedes run a successful market economy. The Germans run a successful market economy. This is a point made by people in my business, the political science business, who write about varieties of capitalism. And I think it's a very fundamental point that there isn't only there is an issue about here to there, but I think it's also very important to appreciate the variety of theirs that we could get to. And we can, the great, in some ways, the greatest of these economic success stories in terms of growth rates is China. And there's sort of the rule of law, and there's sort of market.
Not that much, though.
But not very much. And I know that
not a lot of clarity of the rules, and yet just phenomenal growth.
Phenomenal growth. And I know there are some people who think, and I frankly think this is a completely beyond ridiculous thing to think, that, listen, just imagine how fast the Chinese would be growing if they only had all of those things. Instead of growing at 10%, they'd be growing at 15 or 20%. Of course, that might mean that they'd be building 2 coal-burning power plants a week instead of just 1, and not such good news. But I think that's a kind of goofy view. So I think it's important in saying that we should show a lot of humility about, in our understanding and our appreciation of getting from here to there. I think we also have to be a little bit cautious about our understanding of what the there is, and an appreciation of there being a diversity of ways of saying what there is.
Yeah, I will grant that what I spelled out is what we know what works. It doesn't have a lot of content in the present context. It had a lot more content 20, 30 years ago when there was the full-fledged debate going on between people who thought markets worked and people who thought central plannings worked. But that debate's over and the market guys won, which means that this general spiel that we need functioning market economies doesn't tell you a lot. And you're absolutely right. There's many different ways to skin the cat, and they work more or less well, and in particular they work well or not so well given the particular history and path-dependent kind of context in which a particular country is operating. And so I agree that there isn't a one-size-fits-all program to move towards higher growth.
Well, I hope we can find something to disagree about before we go, but that's okay. I don't put too much weight on disagreement. I think that's an important point for everybody to appreciate, and I take your point that there was a time, I'm not sure if it's 20 or 30 years ago, but maybe 30 years ago, certainly 40 years ago, when saying markets in some sense or another of the many ways in which you have markets, that markets are important, was more of a contestable proposition than it is now, and I think, I agree with your statement that it's become there's much more widespread agreement about that now, and that the real action is on what kind of market economy you have and how stable
and I think that
yeah.
That what we've come to see is that the things you can see from 30,000 feet aren't very useful. They're necessary but not sufficient. So I'm not going to say that the Washington Consensus was wrong. I don't know if I think countries' development prospects are much brighter when they don't have hyperinflation and huge budget deficits. Their prospects are much brighter when they're open to and inviting of foreign investment and open to international competition, at least to some considerable degree, and that there's not much of a track record of sustainable moves from poverty to affluence on the back of state-owned industry. So I think all of those things needed to be done. It just turned out that it wasn't enough.
Yeah, not nearly.
It also turns out that a lot of reforms, just because you call something reforms doesn't mean that they really are. And so a whole bunch of what was called neoliberalization during the 80s and 90s was shot through with compromises and corruption and half measures and failed and halting execution. And it's no particular surprise that bad governments with bad institutions and bad political cultures can't generate very high-quality reforms.
Yeah. Yeah, no, what's surprising is that bad governments with bad institutions run by not-so-good people sometimes do good things. It's all a mystery. Anyway, Nancy Birdsall. Nancy's piece begins, actually, from a discussion of the East Asian experience, and the lesson that she takes, her piece is really about equality and development. And the lesson that she takes from the East Asian experience is that having had initially pretty high levels of equality as a consequence of land reform, and initially very high levels of education and high levels of investment in education, that was really the foundation of the success of the East Asian experience. And so far from it being the case that the existence of inequality is good for growth, or that the existence of growth generates, at least in its initial phases, a la traditional stories, generates more inequality, her thesis in the first instance is that equality actually turned out to be pretty good for economic growth and development, and that high levels of inequality of a kind that you had, say, in Latin America, Brazil being the extreme case of this in Latin America, that those turned out to be real bad for growth, and that the inequality turned out to be bad for growth partly for economic reasons.
Right.
You got a lot of inequality in a pretty underdeveloped economy. It's hard for people to have access to credit, even though it's people who are living at the low end who may benefit the most from the credit. Political systems tend to be pretty dysfunctional when you have extreme levels of inequality because they're run by the rich who have their own predispositions to corruption and their own policy preferences, and also not too good for the kind of accumulation of the trust and social capital that arguably is also facilitative of economic growth. So the argument is that actually equality can be pretty good for economic growth, although how you get that foundational equality is itself a complicated matter. And then she also thinks that under conditions of large inequality, it's not so clear that globalization and participation in the global economy is going to be all that good for development. That she's, pretty favorable at the end of the day to a larger role for global rulemaking bodies like the bank or potentially the IMF or the World Trade Organization. And she thinks that the problem with these organizations is not that they're too strong, but arguably that they're too weak. And maybe, I'm not sure that she would quite agree with this, but maybe a way of supplementing what she's saying is that an organization like the World Trade Organization is too weak to try to do some kind of binding together of trade regulation or trade deregulation, making trade rules, with paying attention to issues about labor standards or environmental standards, and maybe what's required is more bundling of those policy areas together in a way that the WTO doesn't really have the strength to do yet. But those are the two big points in her thing, is that inequality may not be so great for growth, and when you've got a lot of inequality, globalization, greater participation in the global economy may not be so helpful for you.
Yeah, I thought the essay, well, Nancy Birdsall is a very smart woman, and the essay is filled with lots of sensible things, and many of which I agree with, some of which I don't, and I would say moving the WTO into labor and environmental regulatory regimes isn't something that I'm in favor of. But at any rate, I found the kind of the framing device of inequality not very helpful because, as Birdsall states quite clearly, there's good inequality and bad inequality. There's the good inequality that's going on in China right now because you had a country that was equal in poverty, and now some people are getting rich, and that increases inequality, and it's providing an incentive for people to come to the cities and participate in the fast-growing urban economy, and that's a good thing. On the other hand, you have the bad Latin American-style inequality where you've got not well-functioning market institutions, most people trapped in poverty, and a tiny elite that lives off land ownership and political favoritism. And so I'm not sure how inequality fits into this. What you're really saying is that inequality can be associated with good institutions or bad institutions, and so what's the real issue is getting the institutions right. If you create growth-friendly policies and institutions, you're going to get good inequality, and if you don't, you're going to have bad inequality. So I didn't find. I don't think inequality is really a kind of a causal variable. Of course, there's a vicious circle that goes on, so that if you do have the bad Latin American style inequality, then you don't have the kind of middle class pressure to improve your political institutions that you would get if you had a thriving economy and a growing middle class. And so, in that sense, inequality is an obstacle to growth. But at any rate, that's my problem with her big
Well, I
picture.
think she does distinguish between good inequality and bad inequality, and I think there's a tricky issue here, because the good inequality isn't just growth facilitating inequality. I think maybe more fundamentally, the good inequality is the inequality that arises under conditions where you have a decent range of opportunities for people. So the good inequality is the inequality that emerges from decisions that people make about the use of their talents and resources under conditions of genuine equality of opportunity. And there's a tricky thing here. I'm trying to push us into a discussion of your ideas about liberaltarianism.
Okay, we'll get there.
There's a tricky issue here, which is how do we understand the value of equality of opportunity, which is a fundamental political value in the country, in the United States, a fundamental political value in lots of parts of the world. And at some level of abstraction, maybe you have to go to 30,000 feet, a common ground among more egalitarian liberals, say me, and more classical libertarian liberals, say you.
Yes.
Maybe we understand equality of opportunity a little bit different. The very difficult thing is how do you ensure that you've got equality of opportunity across the generations without worrying about just sheer inequality itself. You get too much economic inequality, too much inequality of income, too much inequality of wealth, and it's kind of undermining of the kind of equality of opportunity that gives people chances to make use of their talents and resources to do socially constructive and productive things, both for their own lives and for the lives of the wider society. So maybe you could say something, Brink, about your liberaltarianism. You propose in that piece, I guess, was it in the New Republic?
Yes, December of last year.
I'm a political philosopher by training, by business. It's my day job.
Yes.
And maybe by intellectual and professional deformation. So the line in your piece that I latched onto was a line at the end about bringing Hayek and Rawls into the same view, or at least the same conversation, and proposing some kind of marriage of a Hayekian classical liberalism and a Rawlsian egalitarian liberalism. And maybe you could say something about that in connection with this issue about equality of opportunity and equality of outcome.
Sure. Well, it's I think not that preposterous of a proposed union because Hayek himself, who is one of the great champions of classical liberalism in the 20th century, was quite impressed with Rawls's theoretical structure, and in his own writings on social justice, and Hayek didn't like that term at all, but he meant something different by it than Rawls did. And so in discussing the apparent divide between them, Hayek said that he thought there was a great deal of similarity and overlap between his basic theoretical approach and that of Rawls, and of course there is, because they're both liberals, and liberalism starts with putting primary value on the individual and on individual flourishing, and as a constituent part of individual flourishing, individual autonomy, and so classical liberals and more egalitarian liberals start with a bedrock commitment, and it, in the current day, leads to or is reflected by the overlap between libertarians and liberals on issues of personal and civil liberty, but the difference, or the main conflict, has been on individual autonomy in the economic sphere. Classical liberals have stressed sort of freedom from overweening government, whereas modern liberals have stressed freedom from the vagaries of birth and economic circumstance. Now, you can make that into a very radical point of difference, but Hayek himself, and also one of the other great classical liberals of the 20th century, the recently deceased Milton Friedman of the Hoover Institution that you can see out your window.
Absolutely.
Both supported a modicum of redistribution, a social safety net, which I lay out in that New Republic piece, that I think that those kinds of differences, although they're real, the priorities I assign to things are different from the ones you do. I think they're not so yawning these days that they can't be bridged if indeed people were interested in bridging them. So within the liberal camp today, there is a hugely heterogeneous grouping of ideas, and yet everyone considers themselves liberals or of the left or progressives or whatever, and so they see these as differences within the tent, and there's a spirit of compromise and tolerance and working things out and looking for points of agreement and so forth that you don't get with people outside of your in-group. And so my bid is for liberals and libertarians to start thinking of themselves as liberals, and then perhaps the differences and the real differences they have might appear more tractable if they see themselves united in important common efforts.
Yeah. I mean, I thought there were a number of interesting points that you made in the piece. In some ways, I thought the most striking, politically speaking, was that you were, I suppose, in a way suggesting that the kind of alliance, the political alliance that's existed between classical liberals, libertarians in the sense of classical liberals of the Hayekian and Milton Friedman style, that the alliance that's existed between them and social conservatives through the Republican Party, well, that's really fractured, and that there was a potential now for a politically comparable alliance between classical liberals and more egalitarian liberals of to put it political philosophically, of the Rawlsian kind,
right?
That has arguably similar promise. And as I understood it, the way to create that alliance was not to talk about points of fundamental philosophical difference, but to observe that there are a variety of policy areas. There's some philosophical similarity, hostility, opposition to, as you describe it, homophobia and blastocystophilia.
Yes.
Concerns about the high degree of imprisonment in the United States as a consequence of punitive drug laws.
Right.
Punitive, and if I may say, in their application, racially differential. I want to say racially biased, maybe that's true too, but racially differential. That's
yes.
A very substantial concern. Glenn Lowry was just here at Stanford last week giving some lectures on imprisonment in the United States, and powerfully made this point in a very interesting set of lectures. So there are some important points of agreement. The big issues of disagreement have been on areas about the role of government and public policy in addressing social, economic concerns. And I guess the place where I would see the discussion having to go in order to bridge that gap would be, it would start with issues about whether there's a willingness on the part of the classical liberal to address three concerns. One are concerns about education. Second, health and health care. And the third is income inequality. Now, I'll note here that Charles Murray has, as you know, has recently picked up on the idea of universal basic income, which he attributes rightly to Milton Friedman's endorsement
negative
in
income
Capitalism
tax, yes.
and Freedom of a negative income tax. It's also been a very important idea, the universal basic income idea, in the kind of the more libertarian strand of the European left. My very good friend and other political philosopher, Philippe Van Parijs, has been part of the basic income movement. So I'd say three areas of focused discussion. Different political philosophical premises, you've described them, but maybe some common overlap on a willingness to address the importance of education in getting people into the market, the importance of health and health care in both getting people into the market and keeping them in there, not constantly distracted by the need to, by worries about whether or not they're going to be able to remain healthy and get decent health care if they need it. And then also some concern about the need for some basic level of income in order to address fundamental life needs. And also, if you wanted to think about it this way, to keep people in the market with a range of opportunities. I do think for the egalitarian liberal like me, I see those as matters of basic fairness, and I'm not going to ask you to endorse that. For the classic,
let me just back up a little bit and talk about the issue of ideological realignment or ideological flux that we find ourselves in now, because that's an opportunity for me to plug my book, which is coming out next month, my new book, The Age of Abundance, How Prosperity Transformed America's Politics and Culture. You'll laugh, you'll cry. It's the feel-good hit of the summer. But in particular, I tell the story of mass prosperity in the United States since World War II and how it has driven transformational cultural changes, and how those in turn have changed what it means to be on the left and what it means to be on the right, and have brought us to through the culture wars and red versus blue to the current muddle we're in. And in particular, I make the argument that mass affluence created all kinds of new possibilities and brought new values and new priorities to the surface. Basically, when people no longer have to worry about basic material sufficiency, they start worrying about all kinds of other things, and in particular, quality of life and self-realization, and that the cultural upheaval of the 60s and 70s, civil rights movement, environmentalism, feminism, hedonism, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, none of that can be understood except as an outgrowth of the revolution, the social revolution of mass affluence, which kicked in the 1950s. The plot of the book comes from the fact that faced with these new conditions, the people most alive to the new possibilities and the new values of mass affluence were people on the left, the people at the forefront of the civil rights movement in feminism and environmentalism and sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Yeah, we have better drugs, better sex, and better music.
Those very same people tended to despise the middle-class values and capitalist economics which had created the affluence which made their shtick possible. Meanwhile, the defenders of capitalism and middle-class values were people who were traditionalists, social conservatives, who were defending these things amongst a whole panoply of received traditions, and therefore people who were extremely uncomfortable and or even overtly hostile to the cultural dynamism that was being unleashed by capitalism. And so in my telling, after this Sturm und Drang of the 60s and 70s, we've got a new, more libertarian America in which the institutions of markets and the basic middle-class values of a work ethic and personal responsibility have been preserved, but in a much less authoritarian and more open and minded and tolerant cultural context, and yet our ideologies of left and right today continue to be kind of stuck in the past, really fighting over the 60s again and again, the right still being very uncomfortable with the cultural changes that have been ushered in since the 60s, and the left uncomfortable with the economic changes, the new, more entrepreneurial, more competitive, more globalized economy that has occurred. And so that leads then into the liberaltarians piece I did for the New Republic, in which I basically brokered a kind of deal that you give us free markets, we'll give you the welfare state. I have my ideas of about what kind of welfare state makes most sense for the people we're trying to help, but that's the basic kind of deal that's on the table, and we'll see how attractive it is. And of course, there's a million devilish details to work out. But again, you can't really even start working that out unless you think it's worthwhile, unless you think that these people, these libertarianish, economically conservative, socially liberal types who have tended to be aligned with Republicans and now find themselves kind of in the total political wilderness, whether you think that they are worthy folks to sit down with and try to seek common ground with.
Well, I do. We're running out of time. I want to continue this conversation because I'm, as I say, more one of these egalitarian liberals, but I do feel I teach Hayek and I teach Milton Friedman. I teach an undergraduate course here at Stanford called Justice, and we have Friedman and Hayek both on the reading list, and I do think that there's some common ground. I don't think the common ground is at the most fundamental philosophical level, but I do think that there are points of convergence, including points of convergence on the issues that I was describing earlier about health and about education and on the cultural side, I'm perfectly prepared to say that Google is the whole Earth catalog of the new millennium, and so there's maybe some cultural continuity there, but there was a very different economic sensibility that was expressed in the whole Earth catalog than is expressed in the people who are doing Google, who are making bazillions of dollars, although now they're using those bazillions of dollars for, among other things, some very constructive social purposes, including investing in the issues that we started with, which is to say issues about poverty and destitution in underdeveloped economies, which is, alongside the global warming, I think the largest moral challenge that we face. But we talked at the beginning about needing to end around.
No, I know you need to leave, and so perhaps we can do this again and dive down into the thickets of education and healthcare and other issues, and see if we can come to some sort of partial agreement about some of those things. But at any rate, great talking to you today.
Good to talk to you, and I'm ready to go for next time. Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Great. Bye.